Hello friends, today we'll be learning a very important concept which is partition by, which is used into the advanced SQL. So whenever we are solving some advanced level questions into the SQL, we use the partition by concept. Now when to use this partition by concept, we'll be seeing into much more detail into the video ahead with the help of a data set. You can understand partition by to be something similar to group by, but by similar I don't mean they function in a similar way, but deep down the concept that is kind of similar, but they are totally different things. So please don't assemble into one. They are totally different. The group by is totally different. The partition by is completely different. Partition by also comes into the advanced SQL or the window function thing, and it has its own application. So different problems, they take a different concept. So some problems you'll be using the group by, into some of the problems they can be solved by partition by. So from the name itself, the partition by, it is clear that we'll be partitioning something. So what do we exactly mean by partitioning? So by partitioning we mean, like, let's say into your data set there are some subsets which are present. Now you will tell me, Ashutosh, you are confusing me a lot by telling what are these subsets, like what exactly are these subsets. So friends, you can see onto my screen this data set here. Into the column A I have the ID, into the column B I have the state name, the column C I have the dates, and into the column D I have the sales. So you can take this entire data set into account. But what if I can just break this data set or partition this data set onto the basis of one of the column, depending on your criteria, depending on the problem which you are trying to solve. But one of the column which is very easy, which we can just see here, is the state column. So we can just partition our data set basis onto each of the state. So when we are partitioning our data set, we are just taking them separately. So this is how the code internally it works. After we have mentioned into our code like partition onto the basis of the state column, all these entire data set will be partitioned onto the basis of the states. So you can see here all these three partitions will be created internally, and this is how the code internally it works. And after this, all these actions will be taken upon. By actions I mean you can just rank them, you can get the first value from all these partitions, you can get the last value, and many more such operations you can do. One more example similar to this can be, let's say I have a data set, and into that particular data set I have the details of all my subscribers, all my followers onto LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube. So I have all the details, like I have details of the subscriber name, when they have subscribed, onto which date they have subscribed. So you can assume it to be something like some data sets are for Instagram, some data sets are for YouTube, some data sets are for LinkedIn. And these are all kind of different partitions which you can think upon, like the entire data set can be taken into account as a whole, and into the entire data set there are many partitions, and these partitions are based on to the social media. Instagram will be taken into account differently, LinkedIn will be taken into account differently, and Facebook or the YouTube will be taken into account differently. And from these particular partitions, let's say if I want to get the very first subscriber who had subscribed my YouTube channel, the very first person who had followed me onto the Instagram, the very first person who had followed me onto the LinkedIn. So I can get all these data sets using the partition by concept which we have seen here. So I hope the partition by concept is very much clear now. But we'll be seeing the SQL query for this, we'll be seeing some more advanced level concepts into this, into the data set which I prepared for this particular video. So you can see the data set onto my screen here. Into the column A I have the player name, into the column B I have the stadium name, into the column C I have the year name, into the column C I have the year, into the column D I have the runs scored by this particular player, and into the column E I have the country. I'll just explain what all these data set is all about, and also I have imported this particular data set into the SQL Server Management Studio. And so if you want to know how to install or import this particular data set into the Management Studio, you can watch this video which is popping out right now onto your screen. Friends, let us move to our data set and understand this into much more detail here. So for example, player 1, you can see into Eden Gardens into the year 2018. He has scored 421 runs and the country is India. I mean, the player's country is India. Similarly, for player number as 3, he has scored into the Eden Gardens. So these are stadium names, cricket stadium names which are present in India. And into the year 2018, he has scored 393 runs and the country is England. Now these are not some absolute numbers or real numbers. I have just prepared this data set. I'll be attaching this entire data set onto the description box of this video. Now what all do we need to calculate here? We need to calculate all these data points which I mentioned here. So we will be calculating all these data sets here. I'll just provide a serial number for this, and I'll just drag this formula to the very last. So we'll be calculating these 8 different metrics which are mentioned here using SQL query. So the very first thing which I'm concerned is I'm only concerned with the Indian players. This data set, you can see this contains the data for the Indian players, New Zealand players and the England players. But I'm only concerned and I want to filter the data just for the Indian players. Let us do or write the SQL query for this. So select star from this table where country is equal to, and I'll write my country name here. Execute this button. So you can see I've got the data set for just the Indian players. So the very first thing is cleared. Now let us understand these two concepts, partition by ground and partition by ground, and also here what does this mean. So I'll just make a new sheet and I'll help you make this understand into much more detail. Now before this, let us filter all the Indian players from here. Okay, I'll just select this, Control C and Control V, and you can see I've got these entire data set. Now what is the next concept also which we need to understand here? I'll remove the filter. We are concerned with partition by ground, comma here. Now what does these two things mean? What does these two sentences they mean? Now partition by ground, as I've explained into this video earlier, we were partitioning our data set onto the basis of, let's say I took the social media example earlier. So we were partitioning our data set basis onto the social media, Instagram, LinkedIn, likewise, and similarly we were partitioning our data set basis onto the state name. Here we need to partition our data set basis onto the ground name. So I'll just apply the filter onto the each of the ground. So we just have 2 grounds. So if when we are partitioning our data set basis onto the ground, I'll be getting my first data set here for Eden Gardens, and the next ground which I am having is 1KD. So I'll just copy this data set as well. So internally I just want to make it very much clear, like how does the code it runs internally, so that whenever we are writing our query, we are just not writing it, we are writing it with proper understanding. We are writing each word, like what does it exactly mean and how will this particular word or clause which we are writing or the function which we are writing, how does this internally works. And this particular thing mainly helps us into, we don't get confused whenever we are writing our SQL query. So friends, when we are partitioning by ground, so this particular data set would come up, which you can see in yellow, and later on we'll be partitioning our data set onto the basis, and we'll be understanding what does this partition by ground and comma here, what does this mean. So let us see this also. So first of all, internally our data set would be partitioned onto the basis of the ground name. So first of all, Eden Gardens would come up here, and then you can see comma here has been provided, so it will again be partitioned onto the basis of here. So the data set which we have got here is for Eden Gardens and 2018. This is the very first partition will be created. Similarly, Eden Gardens 2019, this data set will be created. Okay, and similarly Eden Gardens and to 2021, this data set will be created. Now this was for Eden Gardens. There is another stadium and that is Wankhede. So I'll just select this Wankhede here. Now this data set will again be partitioned onto the basis of the year and the stadium. So this is the data for 2021. Again I want to get the data for 2019. So I will apply the filter. So you can see the partitions internally, they will be created like this. And at the very last I have 2018 and I'll just paste this here. Now into the video ahead I told one thing about the subsets. So now it will be very much clear what did I meant by subsets. So you can see this is the entire set or the entire data which I was having, and from this entire data I am creating all these subsets, and these subsets are based on the partition by thing which I am providing here. So friends, I hope these two concepts are now very much clear. Moving forward, I have this order by clause, and we can also order by our dataset basis onto the year. Let us start solving the problem. The very first problem which we want is apply rank partition by ground and year. Whichever player has scored the highest runs into a particular ground will be first partitioning by onto the basis of ground, and later also I'll be adding ground and comma year. So let us see how to do this. So what do we need? We need to provide the rank, and over I need to provide, first of all we need to partition our data sets. The very first thing which we need to do, partition by, and which column do we need to partition by? We need to partition by onto the basis of the stadium name column, and again order by. So order by onto the basis of what? Order by onto the basis of runs. The player which will be getting the highest runs, they will be providing the rank as 1. So we need to order by onto the basis of the descending order. So I just need to provide here DESC, and that's all is required. And this is the rank. I'll just provide this and I'll execute this particular query. So it is telling us syntax errors. For this I'll just rename the column here because the space is there, and spaces should not be mentioned into the column names. So I'll just rename this thing here, and I think it should work perfectly fine after this. So I'll just execute the query. So you can see I've got the rank for each of the rows, for each of the rows and for each of the stadiums. Say I want to get the player which has scored the highest runs into each of the stadium into all those 3 years. So for Eden Gardens I want to get the ID of the player which has scored the highest runs, and for Wankhede I want to get the ID of the player which has scored the highest runs. So friends, let us see how to do this. So for doing this I'll just provide this into a subquery here, and after this I'll just write a select star from this, and I'll provide this as an alias as a, where a dot rank is equal to 1, and I'll execute this query here. So you can see player ID as 1 has scored into the Eden Gardens 469 runs, and player ID as 1 has scored into Wankhede 450 runs, and into each of the year we have got here, and the rank is 1. Player 1 is the person who is scoring the highest runs into each of the stadium. So but let us take in one more constraint into consideration here. So I'll just delete this. We'll be using this again, but I'll just delete this. As I've told, like, we'll be also seeing partition by 2 columns instead of this. So here we just partitioned by onto the basis of the stadium name, but into the stadium name we have another column here, the year. So let us also partition by onto the basis of the year column as well, and let us see what is the rank which is being calculated here. So you can see Eden Gardens 2018, the rank has been provided 1 2. Similarly, Eden Gardens for 2019, the rank has been provided 1 2. Eden Gardens for 2021, the rank has been provided 1 2. Now what do we want? We want to get the player who has scored the highest runs into each of the stadium in each year. So we want to get this particular data, or want to get the ID of all those players. So let us see how to do this. So I'll just provide again into a subquery, and okay, I'll just write here a select star from, and I'll name this as A, where A dot rank is equal to 1. That's all is required. I'll execute the code, and you can see player 1 in Eden Gardens in the year 2018 is getting the rank 1. Player 1 in Eden Gardens in 2019 has scored the highest runs, 469, and getting the rank 1. Player 2 in Eden Gardens in 2021, he has scored 463 runs and is getting the rank 1. So friends, I hope the concept is very much clear now, how we can use the partition by clause into the advanced SQL problems, and we can also partition by using multiple columns. If we are just thinking like partition by can only be acted upon a single column, it is wrong. We can use the partition by into multiple columns as well, and we can partition our data set into different subsets using the partition by clause, as we are seeing here. So friends, moving forward, we have the next problem onto the partition by is, so we have seen this using first. Okay, so first value we want, so we want to get the first value of the top run scorer into the ground, and later we will be seeing partitioning by into ground per year. So let us see and let us calculate this particular thing also. So I'll just remove everything, and I'll do a select star from, and what is the database name? So it is DBO, and what do we want? So we want to get the first value or the player ID who has scored the highest runs into each of the stadiums. So we just want an additional column here. So the first value, I'll just mention it here. What is the first value? Like which column do we want to get the first value? We want to get the first value from the player name. So I'll just mention, it should be player ID, but no worries, it is player name. So and over, and partition by stadium name, and onto what basis do we need to order our data set here? So we need to order our data set onto the basis of the runs column, and that's also highest. One more thing, it should be into the descending order as well, because I want to get the data of the player who has scored the highest runs. So I'll just write here highest runs scored. That's all is required. Let us execute the query. And also one more thing, we are just concerned with the Indian players, so I'll just add where clause, where country is equal to, and I'll just write here India. I'll execute the code. We have got the P1 into the entire column, because into Eden Gardens P1 has scored the highest runs in the history of the Eden Gardens, like not into the history but into all these 3 years. In Eden Gardens, player 1 has scored the highest runs, and similarly player 1 has scored the highest runs into all these 3 years. So that is why we are getting player 1 entirely. Similarly, you can get the last value, or the player which has scored the lowest runs. So we can use the last value thing here to get the player name which has scored the lowest run. We are not getting the correct result, so for the getting the correct result, we need to use this particular clause, which is the rows between clause. I have made a detailed video onto the rows between clause, so you can watch that video also, and it can clear a lot of your concepts onto the rows between. But if I have to tell you into short, the rows between clause acts on to this particular concept. So you can see the current row I'm taking, and let's say for the current row I want to take into action or operate into some rows which are before the current row and some rows which is below the current row. So we'll be using the rows between concept, but you can watch that particular video which is made entirely onto the rows between concept, and I've tried explaining much more different concepts. So rows between unbounded preceding and unbounded following. You can see P2 has scored the lowest runs into the history of these 3 years into the Eden Gardens. So as you can see, P2 has scored 89 in 2019. So that is why we are getting P2 into the entire column. And similarly, P2 has also scored 88 runs in 2021 in Wankhede Stadium, and that is why we are getting P2 here. So it was just a simple coincidence, like we are getting the same value, but this is how the first value and the last value concept it works into the MySQL server management studio. So friends, what is the next thing which we want? So we want to get the difference between the top scorer and that particular player. So I hope the question is clear. So what is the top scorer runs and what is the runs of this particular player, and I want to get the difference between both the runs. First of all, we'll be partitioning it onto the basis of the ground, and later we'll be partitioning the data set onto the basis of ground and year. So let us calculate this. So what do we want? I want to get the first value. So whoever has scored the highest runs, the player value will come up. So I want to get not the ID here. Now I want to get the runs here, and that's all. I'll just remove this. Let's run the query. Let us see if we are getting the result. So for example, player number 469 runs he has scored into the Eden Gardens, into the history of Eden Gardens into these 3 years, and that is why we are getting 469 into the entire row. Similarly, 450 which we are getting here for Wankhede, player 1 has scored 450 runs into all these 3 years in Wankhede, and I want to get the difference between the highest runs scored and the runs which are scored by all these players. For example, what is the difference between the highest run scored into the Eden Gardens by any player? What is the difference between that number, and what is the difference between the number of runs which are scored by that particular specific player? For example, P7 has scored 356 runs in the year 2021. So the difference which I want is 469 minus 356, and I just want to get this particular difference. So how do we get this particular difference? I would simply subtract this with the runs column here, and I'll be getting the difference. So difference runs. So I'll just execute the code. So you can see I've got the result here. So obviously the player 1 will be having 0 here because he is having the highest runs here, and the next player, he was just short of 6 runs. P1 himself has scored into the year 2018. He was less than by 48 runs. P2 was less than by 109 runs in the year 2018, and similarly P7 was less than 113 runs, the highest runs which have been scored into the Eden Gardens by any player in so this is for year 2021. So I hope the concept is very much clear. Similarly, we can just add the stadium name as well as the year, and the same thing will be calculated. So I'll just execute the code. So for the year 2018 into the Eden Gardens, now this is a subset which I am taking into account. So you can see into the partition I am partitioning by stadium as well as the year. So all these data set will be partitioned based on the stadium name and also onto the year. So for Eden Gardens in the year 2018, 421 was the highest runs which were scored by the player 1. So the difference in runs is obviously 0, and the second highest player which has scored the 360 runs was player 2, and the difference between their runs is 60, like the difference between 61. So like the difference between the player 2 and the player 1 runs into the Eden Gardens in the year 2018. So you can see we are getting this value as well, and this is how we calculated the difference between the runs scored or the more things which we need to calculate. So we have seen this last run scorer partition by ground and year using the last value concept which we have seen earlier into this video. So friends, this was the concept onto the partition by, and this needs to be very much clear when we are solving the advanced level SQL problems, because most of the problems are based into this particular concepts, and the interviewer will be very much interested in confusing you. But with help of these particular things which I have talked about into this video, I hope the concepts will be very much clear, and you would get to know like how the SQL code is working internally. So we are only not concerned with how does the SQL code we are writing or what would come after what, but also we should know like how it should work internally, how everything works internally as well. So friends, I hope you had found this video very much useful. So if you had found this video very much informational, do like this video and also subscribe to my channel if you haven't. I will be bringing much more advanced level SQL concepts which are frequently asked into the interviews, so that it can help you a lot. Meet you in the next video. Thank you so much. Bye.